Hey wonderful people, welcome back to another episode of The Curious Cat. Today's video I'm going to try a bit of a different format here, so please let me know in the comments below what you think of this. Just looking out over this gorgeous view rather than watching me just be a talking head with the camera. So I'll just see if you guys prefer this format or if you like it better when I'm actually facing the camera. So with that being said, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit like on this video. It helps it get out there and reach more people, and it helps me grow the channel, and I'm greatly appreciative for all of that. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Today I'm going to be speaking about Bitcoin and also speaking a bit about these government currencies, fiat currencies, how they're unbacked and how the governments are essentially devaluing them at record rates, and what that means for you as a saver or as somebody who's working for the currencies or holding the currencies, holding your savings in these government currencies. You need to know a little bit about it and what this current economic situation we're in means for your savings. So what's happening is we've entered an economic crisis, and essentially the government has decided to come in and create a whole bunch of currency out of thin air in an attempt to keep these economies afloat, keep things going. So as you've probably heard, they've been bailing out certain corporations, certain industries. They've been giving free money out to the people, and they're getting this money out of thin air. So they essentially just create it out of thin air. They don't have to do anything special for it. They don't have to produce anything of value. They don't have to grow any food or mine any gold or silver or extract any resources. They essentially just create it out of thin air, and then they come on the market with that money and they buy real tangible goods like houses and businesses and big corporations and things like that. So that really isn't free market capitalism. This is a form of socialism, kleptocracy in a sense. They're essentially stealing the assets from the lower middle and even some of the upper class people. They're doing this by getting people exposed to the debt markets and then intentionally crashing the economy, and then they come in with the money they create out of thin air and they buy up the distressed assets. So by doing this, it's a big wealth transfer and they acquire a whole bunch of the assets. So while they're doing this, let's just say they increase the money supply by 10%. What happens is the purchasing power of those dollars will essentially decrease by 10%. It doesn't always happen right away, but that's essentially how it works, because there's still the same amount of goods and services, but they've increased the money supply. So when you know about supply and demand, we know the supply of the currency has increased, but the same amount of goods exists. So what will happen is the purchasing power of those dollars will decrease, because now people demand more of that currency as there's more in circulation for that same underlying asset. And why that's important to us as working class people and lower class people is that we need to understand how this money system is working, because we're so busy working and giving our time and our energy and our life force to our jobs to attempt to save, and a lot of us are trying to pay down mortgages to get ahead and acquire these assets. But in reality, when we're so busy saving these government currencies, they're actually losing their purchasing power at an alarming rate. So for instance, in the Canadian economy, the Canadian dollar has lost 65 to 75% of its purchasing power in only just over 10 years. So that's a pretty dramatic decrease in purchasing power. And so if you're busy saving these dollars, you think you're getting ahead because the number's increasing in your bank account, but it's all the cost of everything, the cost of a home or the cost of food or the cost of other goods and services are all going up, and it's hard to keep up. For instance, homes, which are a great asset if you own it outright and it's producing you income, home prices in Canada have 3x or 4x in value in only a little over 10 years. So that is how inflation works. So the people that own these homes are essentially needing to ask for 4 times the amount of the currency that they were only 10 years ago, because it just doesn't have the purchasing power. So they know that the money isn't hard to get. It's really easy to get. They're just creating it out of thin air, and they put it into the system via the form of debt. So they print it or create it on the computer by adding digits to the money supply, and then they get it into circulation through the form of debt. So they basically come in and they create a bunch of loans, and they loan it out to people who want to get into real estate or start businesses, etc. And then they make money off that. So that's how the money gets into circulation, and then people like you or I come in and we borrow $500,000 or $1 million to buy our first home, and then we pay huge interest on that, and we basically are paying massive amounts of capital to the bankers in order to have access to this money. And what happens is, the more money they create out of thin air, the more it devalues the currency, the more the price of goods goes up. So why that's important is that most of us are saving in these dollars. So you want to be diversified in times like this where we're in a highly inflationary environment, because you don't want to have all your savings in Canadian dollars. So one way to do that traditionally has been to purchase gold or silver, as they are hard to increase the supply of. I've discussed this in past videos, where essentially we know the inflation of gold roughly. Its average is about 2%, so it's a low inflation, and we know that they can't just come in and double the supply in a year if they want, which would essentially cut its purchasing power in half. If you look at the value of gold compared to Canadian dollars, you'll see that since 2008, which is only 12 years ago, it's essentially tripled in value. So you can see that the Canadian dollars are devaluing at an alarming rate. This is the same for American dollars. They're devaluing, they're being inflated away by the governments as they create money to try and paper over these economic crises. And what you want to do is you want to get your capital out of these devaluing currencies. Otherwise, you run the risk of riding the value of that currency down to zero. So we've seen this happen in some of the fringe currencies like Venezuela. Venezuela, over the past 2 years, has been going through hyperinflation, and essentially their currency is just about worthless now. They had over 1,000,000% inflation last year, which is just wild. Essentially, things are just, if you had money, you essentially can't buy anything with it anymore. It holds no value. So the only way that people escaped that devaluation of their dollars was if they were ahead of the curve and they bought alternatives like gold or Bitcoin, and they managed to get the capital out of the country. With gold and silver, that's very hard to do. People have traditionally bought these as a hedge against inflation, but at the same time, there's a lot of capital control and governments clamping down on that. They won't let you leave the country with anything over $10,000 worth of gold or silver. So you really get locked into these currencies as they devalue them, and they essentially rob all your wealth that you've spent your whole life working for. So Bitcoin offers an alternative to that in the sense that it's decentralized, it's not owned by any government, it has a set inflation schedule that every 4 years gets cut in half. So we know the inflation of Bitcoin. We take out that unknown, we take out that vulnerability to having a centralized power control the inflation rate of a currency, and essentially run the risk of that centralized power deciding to devalue the currency. We take that out of the equation with Bitcoin because it's actually put into the program of Bitcoin itself. So the way Bitcoin operates, it's in the computer language of the currency itself. And any programmer or coder can essentially read through the code of Bitcoin and can verify that it's a known thing that the inflation schedule will drop get cut in half every 4 years. So we take out the trust factor. We don't need to rely on humans for trust anymore. It's set into the algorithm of Bitcoin itself, or the protocol of Bitcoin. And so once it's in the program, we know that that's a certain thing. We no longer have to just place our trust in a centralized authority who historically have always ended up corrupting and taking advantage of their power. So that is the beauty of Bitcoin. We also had huge news in the Bitcoin space. Just 2 days ago, Venezuela, being in the current economic situation they're in, they announced that they'll be accepting Bitcoin as payment for passports. So that's pretty big news. That's the first time we've had a government start accepting Bitcoin as payment. And I think this will put pressure on other governments to start doing the same, or to secretly start acquiring small amounts of Bitcoin as a hedge. Because as we see these fringe currencies collapse, I believe that we will start seeing more and more of them adopt stuff like Bitcoin and look for alternatives, because they don't have a choice. Either you ride down your currency to nothing and you lose everything, or you learn about Bitcoin and you essentially start adopting it and purchasing it and holding it to avoid the inflation of your local currency. So the fact that this government has done that, I think, will raise some alarm bells in other countries. Other countries are going to start to consider doing the same, because you don't want to be the last one to the table. You want to be ahead of the curve, and you want to be one of the early adopters so that you can get in while it's still a reasonable price and while there's still somewhat of a supply coming onto the market. You don't want to be one of the governments stuck being the last to the table in, say, 5 or 10 years, once the inflation rate of Bitcoin is down to, say, 0.4%. There's very little new Bitcoin coming onto the market at that point. So then you're stuck paying whatever the people who hold it are demanding. So you're at the mercy of that, and they could be offering a pretty penny for Bitcoin, as there really isn't any alternative to acquiring Bitcoin other than to buy it from one of the miners that's creating new Bitcoin, or to buy it from a current holder. So because the supply is constantly decreasing with Bitcoin, that puts the supply is decreasing, that puts if we have increased demand, which I believe we will, that puts tremendous upside pressure on the price of Bitcoin. And the reason I think we'll have increased demand is because a lot of people will be looking for alternatives, because the governments are inflating their currencies away at a very alarming rate. So if people are going to choose to hold these government currencies, they're going to witness the devaluation of those dollars quite quickly. And at the same time, people are going to be witnessing the early adopters of Bitcoin. They're going to watch the early adopters' value, or their net worth, constantly increase, and the purchasing power of their currency continually move upwards. And that will create a bit of FOMO in the market, which is fear of missing out, if you don't know that term already. And people, they see all these people that adopted Bitcoin in the past 5 years, let's say, they saw them all become millionaires, and they see their government currencies devaluing and lose purchasing power. It starts to raise some eyebrows, and people start asking questions and looking for alternatives. So I believe that's what will basically put some upward pressure on the demand for Bitcoin, as well as these fringe currencies like Venezuela and Iran's next in line. We're watching hyperinflation occur, and essentially these government currencies' value is imploding into the ground, and there's only so many options. You either buy gold, silver, Bitcoin, or you try and get into some assets like real estate or something like that. However, most assets are already overinflated in value because of the fact that so many people are ditching these currencies and they're purchasing assets. So most asset prices are already highly inflated. However, Bitcoin was only created 11 years ago, and there's still a lot of fear around it. So there's still a lot of money that's hesitant to purchase it. And it takes a bit of technical savviness to purchase and safely store it. So a lot of people, they get scared away from the market because of this. And they essentially, especially the boomers, they're afraid of new technology, and they're afraid of the unknown. They don't know how to do it. They get overwhelmed by the techie part of it. And so they're essentially choosing to, keep their money in real estate or keep their money in government currencies. And I believe we're going to go through a deflationary period with real estate. And I think a lot of the purchasing power of these dollars are going to erode away as the governments print at these record high rates. So that will essentially create more demand for Bitcoin. More and more people will adopt it. The people that haven't chosen to adopt it yet will see how it's serving the people who have chosen to adopt it, who have chosen to take that risk. They'll see how they're being handsomely rewarded for that, and that will essentially bring more people over to the space, and more people will essentially be forced or will choose to learn about it and choose to diversify and get some exposure to this new and emerging asset class. So that's just a quick rundown of Bitcoin, of fiat currencies, what's going on in the current market, and the huge news with the government, Venezuelan government, actually accepting Bitcoin as legal payment for a passport in their country. So that's pretty big news. I think that will put some pressure on other governments to start at least getting some exposure. And if we even have some of these big banks, hedge funds, or governments start to want to diversify, even say to get 0.1% exposure to the Bitcoin space, it's such a small space still that that kind of capital, even the tiniest investment, would just skyrocket the price of Bitcoin. So that's why I think there's huge potential here. There still is a lot of risk, as it is a new and emerging asset class. However, I believe the risk to reward ratio is probably the best we'll ever see in the next 20-30 years. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see a new currency emerge that is decentralized and not controlled by any one centralized authority, and to have it where it's actually in the protocol of the currency itself, the properties of the currency and the economic policy of that currency is programmed right in. So there's no question about, do we have to trust a centralized authority? Do we know what they're going to do with inflation, with the supply of it? Do we know what they're going to do with the interest rate, etc.? It takes all of those unknowns out of the equation. And it also offers a lot of freedom in the sense of they can't restrict what we do with that currency. They can't tell us, or they can't limit us from leaving the country with Bitcoin. It's very hard for them to do. And there's no centralized point of attack for them to come in and pretend that the centralized authority is a terrorist organization or something and bomb them and kill them and essentially take out the currency. With its decentralized nature, they don't have that ability. So I see very few ways for the governments to attack Bitcoin. And I also think that with countries like Venezuela starting to accept it, I think we'll see more and more of that. And I think Venezuela will see some tremendous economic benefits from starting to adopt cryptocurrency and being one of the first governments to adopt it, because I think they'll see a lot of the capital from Bitcoin move into the country if they're willing to adopt it and to relax laws around it and to embrace trade with it and to really essentially embrace true free market capitalism. So with that being said, I think that's some great reasons why you should start learning about Bitcoin and try and get in before the massive rush that I believe will happen in the next couple of years. There's a lot to learn about Bitcoin. If you do choose to get into the space, you have to learn how to safely buy it, how to safely transfer it, how to safely store it, and all of those things. So it takes a lot of learning. It took me a number of years to really digest a lot of the information. So it's a good time right now, while the price is still relatively low, to be learning about it. And you can start with any amount. That's a great thing. You can start with $100 or $200 or even $10 or $20 if you want, just to learn how to transact with it, buy it, save it, move it around, all that kind of stuff. And that way, if it really does start skyrocketing and these government currencies start collapsing at an even faster rate, you have the know-how and the ability to get out of these currencies while you still can. So with that being said, I'm going to leave it at that. I've already rambled on long enough. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Again, let me know in the comments below what you think of this new format. Just sitting out, looking out over the lake here. Beautiful view in the Okanagan. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for your attention. God bless. Have a fantastic day wherever you are. And I hope you guys are all finding peace and prosperity in this new economy and this new economic environment.